In this video, we're going to be replacing the alternator in this 2005 Honda Element. Our negative terminal here, 10mm nut. Go ahead and back that off now. And set that aside. So we're going to get our serpentine belt tool on our belt tensioner. We're going to loosen the tension on the belt. And remove the belt from the power steering pump. And ideally what you want to do here is take your belt off, keeping upward tension on the belt so it doesn't come off of the other pulleys. All right, so we're going to have to just spin this inside our serp tool here and release tension on the serpentine tool. And we can go ahead and remove our serpentine tool while holding our belt up. And then what we're going to do here is grab a zip tie and tie our serpentine belt to something up in this general area just to hold it up and somewhat tight. All right, so while I grab a zip tie, I'm going to take the handle of my serpentine tool, put it through the belt just to keep it from falling down. All right, now I'll grab a zip tie and tie our belt up. Now you probably will need a larger zip tie depending on where you want to tie it. But I'm going to go to my AC line. That way it's off to the side and out of the way as much as possible. There we go. Now if we follow our power steering pressure line to our power steering pump, you'll see where it connects up top. We're going to have a 10mm in the back and an 8mm in front. Before you start this process, there still will be residual fluid on this side of the hose. You do not want to get that fluid on your belt or in your pulleys. So what we're going to do is set ourselves up with some kind of spill protection. In this case we have an absorbent pad. We're going to protect the pulleys and the hose the best we can. All right, so now that we have pretty much everything protected that we need to protect, we can go ahead and remove our line. We're going to start with the 10mm on the back. Now I'll move to the 8mm up front. So now we have our two bolts removed. We're going to take our pressure hose and pull it out of the power steering pump. Again, you're going to want to be ready. We have a pad here we're going to put down. We're going to put our pressure hose into that pad. You're going to want to be ready for fluid to come out. Okay, so it's out now. We'll go ahead and put it right in there. And we'll let that fluid collect. What we're also going to do is take a couple more pads and just back this up. So there is fluid in our power steering line because there is fluid in our reservoir. You can see that the level keeps rising, so we have a rag here to stop that from spilling onto the rest of our pulleys and or serpentine belt. Now what we're going to do is clamp off our power steering line. So we're going to remove this power steering line by removing this hose clamp. But before we pull that line off of the power steering pump, because there will be fluid from here to here, there will also be fluid in the pump, we're going to put down a rag, or in our case an absorption pad, to collect any of that fluid. Now, these hoses may have been on there for a while. We're just going to use the needle nose to spin and break that seal. Actually, see if we can just slide this hose off with the pliers. All right, we'll just aim that right into the rag. Let that drain for a minute. Once we have that drained from here to here, we'll go ahead and take this line and fold it back out of our way. We have to remove this pulley. We're going to take advantage of the fact that our pump is still mounted to the vehicle, almost using it as a vise. So we're going to take a long pry bar. We're going to come down at this angle here through the pulley. All right, so we're going to basically brace the pulley right up to the motor mount area. And we're going to use a 19mm socket and break that bolt free. Once you have your bolt free, take your pry bar out. You should be able to just hold your pulley and back that nut off. All right, there's your nut. And now with that same pry bar, just go ahead and pop your pulley right off of that stud. And now we can continue on to remove our power steering pump. So now our power steering pump is held in with 2 bolts. We have one here, which is a 12mm, and underneath where our pulley mounted to, it's going to be one more. It's going to be also a 12mm. We'll go ahead and take those out now. All right, we've got that one pretty loose. We'll go ahead and start on the other one. Okay, so they're both fairly loose. What we can do now is actually move over to a electric tool, speed up the process. So now we have 2 bolts holding in our power steering pump. One's going to be almost directly underneath this shaft here, and one's going to be in the back. They're both going to be 12mm. We'll go ahead and take those out now. Okay, so the reason I didn't take the top one out all the way was to kind of hold it in place. The bottom one I took out all the way. And now we can take the top one out the rest of the way. Now when removing your pump, you can see we have some fluid here, potentially have some fluid left over in here. I'm going to take it out and be careful not to drop any of that fluid on your belt or serpentine system. So our belt tensioner pulley here needs to come off so we have access to the bottom bolt. You can take your motor mount off if you decide to. This is a much easier route. If you decide to take your motor mount off for whatever reason, make sure you're supporting the motor from the underside. To get to our other bolt holding in our tensioner assembly is going to be behind here. So we're going to remove our pulley now. It's going to be a 14mm. We're going to go ahead and remove that using a serpentine belt tool just for the reach. Okay, when you remove your pulley, a couple things are going to happen, or may happen. The bolt will come out, and this little cup here, or washer, is going to want to come out. You want to make sure you get the both of those. You want to make sure you keep them in the same orientation when you put them onto the new tensioner pulley. We have two bolts holding in our belt tensioner. There's one here, and because we removed the pulley, we have access to the other one back here. They're both going to be 12 millimeter. So we'll go ahead and remove those now. Okay, so that's your front one loose. We'll move on to the back. The back, you probably won't be able to visually see, and you might need a small extension. So this back bolt is very difficult to see and potentially get on. What we've actually done was just get it to break free while we were on it slightly at an angle, and we're just using our socket and our hand to take it out the rest of the way. Part of the issue getting to this back bolt is the depth here underneath this motor mount. So we have our two bolts out on the outside of our belt tensioner. Now in the center of this circular part here is going to be your last 12 millimeter bolt. So we'll remove that now. And what you're going to need to do here is take this bolt all the way out with your tensioner in place. And then you'll be able to slide your tensioner straight up and out past your motor mount. So we're going to remove our alternator. To do that, we're going to clear out a little bit of room by removing our overflow coolant. Technically, you do not need to do this, but it's going to gain you a lot more access to work down underneath your alternator. And it's only one bolt holding in your coolant reservoir. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this hose coming from your radiator cap or your radiator to the coolant bottle. We're just going to pull that right off. And set that aside. And now, right up in here, we're going to have one bolt. Our bolt isn't factory, so our bolt's 10 millimeters. Yours should be too, but it might be different. Go ahead and remove this bolt. Now on the inside of there, on the inside of your radiator, there'll be a captured nut, so you're just going to be taking the bolt out. Once you have your bolt out, take your coolant bottle and just lift straight up and out. On the very bottom, there is a tab which sits down into the bottom of your radiator. There's a corresponding tab in the bottom there. Now that this is out, we can go ahead and set it aside. So our top bolt on our alternator here is a 12 mil. Okay, so we got that top bolt loose. We don't need to take it all the way out just yet. Now we're going to move on to the bottom two bolts. So what we're going to do here is remove our fan assembly on the passenger side. There's going to be two bolts up top, 10 millimeter, electrical connection here, and that fan assembly should lean forward and pull out through the motor. The reason we're going to do that is underneath your alternator, you have 2 bolts. If you try and use a deep socket, you're going to run into clearance issues along your fan assembly. So you can either try and find something that will fit in there and allow you to remove those 2 bolts, or you can do what we're about to do and remove our passenger side fan assembly. We're going to start with our electrical connection. I'm just going to unplug that. And then we can come up top and remove our 2 10mm bolts. So now before we remove our fan, I'm going to come over to our alternator and unplug our electrical connection on the alternator. I'm going to squeeze this tab here and just remove our electrical connection off of our alternator and set that aside out of the way. Now that we have our plug out of the way here, we can take our fan up and out of the pins on the bottom, and we should be able to pull it out of the vehicle straight up and out. You may have to do a little finagling around some harnesses. All right, just keep working your fan assembly up and out. You're going to have to work around your hood prop latch there, or catch. And just take your fan right up and out. Now that our fan's out of the way, we have a little bit more room to work with an extension or a deep socket to get these bottom 2 bolts. All right, so you might not be able to see them, but they are directly right behind your air conditioning line here. They're both going to be 12mm. We'll go ahead and take these out now. So now what we're going to do is remove our power cable from the back of the alternator, which means we're going to have to move this boot out of the way. All right, just using a small flathead screwdriver, and we'll get in there with our fingers just to push that out of the way. And all we're looking to do is gain access to that nut right there. Now that, it's going to be a 10mm. Access to that nut. Do your best not to drop it. Now that we have the nut removed, what we can do is pull off our power cable from the back of the alternator. Just like that. And just push that out of the way. Now from here, we're going to remove our last bolt on the top of the alternator. I'm going to fully remove that. At this point, remember, this bolt is the only thing holding in the alternator. So we're going to take this bolt most of the way out. I'm going to grab a hold of the body of the alternator and not the pulley, and take that bolt all the way out. Now from here, we can remove our alternator. So your nut here holds your power line onto the back of your alternator. Alternator is going to come with a new one. It should be loose. If not, it should be a 10 mil. I'm going to go ahead and take this off and set it aside. All right. Now we're ready to lower our alternator into position. Lower that right in. And remember, when you're in here, to take your harness for the alternator kind of back and away, so you're not locking it in behind the alternator and the intake. All right, so with our alternator in position, I'm going to take our top bolt, thread it in. So our top bolt's lined up. And again, these are going to be 12 millimeter. Just go ahead and snug this bolt up. And before we move on to the bottom here, let's go ahead and do our electrical connection from the battery. I'll go ahead and pull that boot back. Sometimes that boot is a little hard to pull back. Just do your best. If you got to roll it back on itself, go ahead. And we're just going to get it onto that stud. And there we go. Now we can thread on our 10 mil. Right, so what I have here is just a small flat blade screwdriver just to push that terminal onto that lug or that stud there. And we can take our 10 mil nut and thread that on. Now you can see that rubber boot's giving us a little clearance issue here, so if you can, try and fold that rubber boot back the best you can. It'll give you a little bit more room to work with some tools. And once you've gotten that nut all the way tightened up, we can go ahead and put our boot back on. This will protect that positive terminal there from shorting out. Okay. Now we can move down to the bottom two bolts. So we're having an issue with this bottom bolt on this side, not wanting to thread in. Most of the times I'll leave all my bolts loose until I get them all in. I didn't do that on this one. So now what I'll do is back these all out till the alternator moves around just a touch. And that'll allow us to get that other one threaded in. All right, so we get that outside one threaded in and snugged up. I'm gonna move over to the other one. All right, that one's snugged up. We'll just come up top, do the same thing. And then before we reinstall our fan and plug this in, we'll come back and we'll torque all these down. So now we're gonna come back, torque down these bolts to 16 foot-pounds. Okay, alternator's torqued down. We can now move on to installing our fan assembly. We're going to take our plug here, our electrical connector, and just kind of move that back behind that rubber boot. We're going to grab our fan assembly and lower it down in. Our fan assembly has 2 pins at the bottom. We're going to have to line up with our radiator. It's just going to be straight down. Okay, fan assembly is in the engine bay. Let's line up the bottom pins. There we go. And we just lean it forward against the radiator, and we'll reinstall the top two 10mm bolts. So now our fan assembly is going to lean backwards up to our radiator, and we're going to put in our 10mm bolts. Now our vehicle, these bolts broke, so they've been replaced. So your bolts will probably look different, but they're still going to be 10mm, and they're still going to be in the same place. So you have one there and one on the inside just by the filler. Go ahead and tighten these up. Okay, move on to the other one. So now our fan assembly is in place. We just have an electrical connection here to plug in, which is our plug that we set aside earlier. Just push those two together to connect, and we can sit this back in the fan assembly here. Okay, now moving forward and continue on here with the alternator. I'm going to take our plug, go ahead and plug that back in. All right. Before we put in our new belt tensioner, we're going to need to remove this pulley here, or this wheel. That will allow us to come down in the vehicle and get access to put in this bottom bolt. The reason is you have a motor mount right here, which also blocks you. So you could do one of two things, I guess. You could remove the motor mount, or you could remove this pulley wheel. We're going to take off the wheel. It's going to be a 15mm. So now with our pulley wheel removed, we can go ahead and lower down into position our belt tensioner, and just take a mental note of where those bolt locations are, because we're going to be looking for them in a minute. The first one we're going to look for is the one straight in the middle. All right, we're going to thread that in by hand. Come back and snug this up. All right, so we don't want it that tight. I'm going to back it off just a little bit. That'll allow the tensioner to move and rock a little bit so we can line up our other bolts. All right, so now we have movement. We can go ahead with our two other bolts. This one's going to be right here in the front. So we've got our front bolt in and our center bolt in, which should pretty much keep it in position for the most part, up and down. It'll keep us within reason, which will now allow us to take our back bolt and find the hole and thread it in. Now, because it's in there, you really can't get your fingers in there to spin it. We're going to try and send this in with a tool. Just going to tighten up this front one to stop it from rocking forward. There we go. And let's keep trying on the back here. Okay, we got the back snugged up. Move around to the front and in the center. Okay, we'll come back, torque those down, and then we'll put our wheel back on. So our 3 bolts here on our tensioner are going to be torqued to 16 foot-pounds. We're going to put on our pulley. All right, so it's just going to go right on top here. Make sure it spins freely. We can put in our bolt. And our bolt here, we can thread in our bolt. And as you're doing this, just keep checking the operation that wheel spins freely. All right, we'll come back and torque it down. All right, so we're going to tighten down our belt tensioner wheel now. It's going to get torqued down to 41 foot-pounds. Now, because of the size width here that we don't have access to with our torque wrench, we're going to go ahead and tighten it down the best we can. If you can get in there, it's going to be 41 foot-pounds. We're going to take our power steering pump pulley. There are grooves inside the pulley. There are also grooves here on the splined end. We're just going to lower it down, let it find its place, make sure it's all the way on. Take our nut and snug that up. Now, there's 2 ways to do this. You can tighten this down outside of the vehicle. You can use some kind of leverage here to stop the wheel from spinning, or you can do that in the vehicle the same way we took it off. So we're just going to make sure this is nice and tight so it doesn't fall off while we're working. We're going to go ahead and put it in the vehicle. We're going to take our new power steering pump, and what we're going to do is lower it down onto the tensioner. We're going to leave it right about here. We're going to take our power steering reservoir feed line that we clamped off, and we're going to reattach that because the power steering pump new has some fluid in it. And if we don't block this line, it's going to start leaking. We don't want that. So we'll take this line, put it into place. And you're going to want to make sure you get it all the way up here. Now go ahead and press that line on. Sometimes you need a pair of pliers to help. And we're not trying to crush this. We're just trying to get a grip on the hose and help us spin and push upwards. Now we have our bottom hose lined up. We can take those needle nose that we were going to use, move our hose clamp into place. Now we don't have any leaks on the bottom leaking into our serpentine belt system, which is ideal. We can now start to mount our power steering pump. We'll start with the back bolt. And then our front bolt is underneath. Now, sometimes you can get to it just straight underneath here. Because we only put this pulley on hand tight, let's make it really easy for ourselves. Just take that pulley right off. Just put that bolt in. And we'll snug that bolt up. We'll come back and we'll torque those down, and then we'll put the top line on and our pulley. So now we're going to torque our power steering pump bolts down to 16 foot-pounds. Now again, some people do this with the pulley on. You can access this with the pulley on. It's just way easier this way. So now that our power steering pump is mounted and torqued down, let's go ahead and finish the top line here. This is going to be your pressure hose. We're going to take that hose, make sure that the O-ring is clean and the surface of this is clean. I'm going to press this down into position. And we're going to put our bolts in place. We're going to have an 8mm bolt in the front. And our 10mm bolt in the back. Now these are going to get torqued down to 8 foot-pounds, or basically tight enough that you can do by hand. So here's the 8mm. We're just going to tighten that, snug it, tighten it, give it an extra little quarter turn, and that's good. The same thing with the 10mm. Get it snugged up, tighten it, a little quarter turn. So now we're going to take our power steering pump pulley, slide that back on here, make sure that those grooves align. It's seated all the way in. I'm going to take our nut and thread it on tight by hand. And then we're going to take a pry bar of sorts and lock this pulley from spinning. And we'll go ahead and tighten this down. Okay. Now your power steering pump is installed. So we've got upward tension on our belt, and for the most part, it's in the grooves and on the pulleys that it needs to be on. It's a little bit shifted over because now we have to get it onto our power steering pump. But you can see our tensioner's in the way, so we're going to have to move our tensioner, or also known as put tension on our tensioner, to relieve pressure on our belt. Hold on. A little bit easier done on this side. So you're going to have to take your belt and get it between the pulley and this tool here, so that way when the tool's backwards, you can put your belt where it needs to go. So get it on top of this bolt. Get your tool backwards. Get your hands in front of this. Now we have the tensioner loose. We can now put our belt onto the power steering pump. And release tension from the tool and put tension onto the belt. Give it a couple of rotations. Make sure everything looks good. At this point, you might want to go back down underneath. Make sure it looks good on all the other pulleys in the system. If everything looks good, move on. Reconnect our negative terminal and make sure it's down as far as it'll go. And tighten up our nut. You want to come over here and check your power steering reservoir. You'll see you have two lines. You have an upper and a lower. In our case, our reservoir is completely empty. So what we're going to do is pop the cap, and we're going to fill between those two lines. What we've done is replace our power steering pump as well as drain our pressure line, so we know From here, once we get into the vehicle, start and run our vehicle, we're going to move our steering from lock to lock, full turns all the way, both left and right, to cycle the power steering fluid through the lines and through the pump. This level should drop down to where we need it to be. If once all that's done, we come back out here and we're below the lower line, we'll add it back up to between these two lines. Once you've done that, you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.